Ian, it is such a great honor to have you back on my YouTube channel.
Thank you so much for having me as always. It's always a pleasure to chat. I know we've been talking a lot recently, so I hope we can keep it going.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I always appreciate your commentary. I think you know, I hate that people get upset when we say we're biased, but it's like I naturally have to come from a perspective
Hmm.
um, because there's no neutrality, especially in politics. I feel like it's tough to play the middle ground. I think it can be done in some areas, but you got to land somewhere, and I appreciate that you land somewhere, but at the same time, you're willing to criticize the place where you land.
Well, I think having a bias is a natural position for anyone to be in. I think the biggest problem is when people claim not to have a bias, like CNN, for example, and just use that as a veil to cover really any subjectivity they have. I think that's the bigger crime. I think everyone's biased to some degree. You just got to be honest with it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. 100%. So let's get straight to it. Ian, we talked last week. You had me on your show. Um, and last week we talked about Black Lives Matter a bit. We hit
Hmm.
on, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, but we discussed quite a bit, especially when it came to just the different events that happened um, here in America recently. We talked about the Karen in Central Park, Ahmaud Arbery. We talked about Joe Biden's racist remarks, because that's what they were, but also
Hmm.
George Floyd. And since then, a lot has happened.
A lot.
Um, a ton has happened since then. And that's kind of the beauty of being a political commentator, but the tragedy at the same time, right? There's always something to talk about, but then at the same time, you wish there wasn't so much to talk about.
Yeah.
Um, but I'll start off by asking you, what do you think about Black Lives Matter? Now, you are a foreigner. You come from the UK and you move
Hmm.
here, and then so I think you have a really good outside perspective. Now, being a Black conservative, I'm not allowed to criticize Black Lives Matter because I
Oh,
don't.
and I am.
I know, right?
That
And
seems
that's what
fair.
I was going to get to. I don't have the space to criticize them because I'm a Black male. Period. I don't.
Mhm.
Even though I may, I it's not. They don't view it as credible, right? They view me as biased. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm ignorant, whatever you might want to call me. So for you, as you just said, you don't have any grounds. But I do think that an outside perspective is a good thing,
Mhm.
right? Any company that wants to know what they're doing wrong always has an outside company kind of critique what they're doing. It could be financially, it could be leadership wise, it could be a number of different ways, but someone from the outside has a perspective that's beneficial. Um, and so you being a Englishman who came over to the United States and now you're experiencing everything that's going on here, and you're a conservative on top of that. Tell me, what do you think about this whole Black Lives Matter movement? And please feel free to be specific on specific examples if you choose.
Sure. So I think the problem with Black Lives Matter is the same with most movements that have exploded from either the left or the right of American politics, in that it starts with good intentions. So I think a good example to compare it to is the Me Too movement, for example. Like Me Too started with a real problem and then devolved into being hijacked for political gain. And I think the same is true for Black Lives Matter. So you've got this underlying argument, at least from my perspective, that some people believe that Black Lives Matter less. I feel like that's the literal argument that Black Lives Matter is making, is that
Yes.
some people don't care about Black people being killed, whereas they do care more about other people being killed.
Mm-hmm.
I think if that is the sole argument, everyone can get on board with that. I think the vast majority of people think that, to use the phrase all lives matter, which is another statement that's been pulled apart in the wrong direction. I feel like everyone actually agrees that all lives matter, including all Black lives. Like that should be the foundation on which we move forward together. The problem that I found with Black Lives Matter is that it's morphed into this general and quite broad political movement that includes a lot of the stuff that the radical left also want. So it calls for the effective destruction of law and order, which, if you want to reduce the death of Black people, that's not a great way to do it. You're basically leaving a ton of minority communities completely undefended and at the mercy of the crime that goes on in many of these communities. And it's the same with the Me Too movement. It started with wanting to give women a platform, and in some cases men, but mostly women, a platform to discuss and be taken seriously when they tell their story of being sexually assaulted. The problem is it morphed into this case where you must believe all women, and women are inherently truthful because of their gender.
Mm-hmm.
And so my overall opinion of Black Lives Matter is it started with good intentions, but it's been hijacked intentionally and unintentionally. And so now it's hard to support because some of the things they call for, I just can't agree with. So I can't agree with, for example, the view that all police officers are racist. I don't think there's evidence for that. And I think it's drastically bigoted to claim so without evidence. I don't believe, for example, that America is systematically racist. That's not to say that there aren't instances of racism or that racists don't exist. But that's a pretty huge jump to go from individuals are racist to every single person in this group is racist. And if you disagree with me, you are therefore also racist. It's a very dangerous step. So that's kind of where I am with it right now. And again, as a white male, my views don't really hold much weight on this view, but I think it's important to say what you think on this matter.
So I think you made a very good point when it came to Black Lives Matter and how they use these universal statements when they're talking about cops or even white people in general. But then the moment you push back on that, I mean, you're labeled a racist, and it seems like the arguments are very elementary, right? Not to say that like their intentions are good about Black Lives Matter, saying Black Lives Matter too. We get all that, but yeah, it's very hard to argue with them. But then what we see happening now is the aftermath of George Floyd's death has caused a lot of the riots that are now taking place. And you see protests and you see riots. So before I get into what I think about it too much, I want to get your perspective. Like, what do you think about all these riots going on and just everything that's ensued in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder?
So I think the most important distinction here is the line between protesting and rioting. So if we focus on the protesting, I think it's completely justified. I think the anger towards the instance regarding George Floyd is absolutely justified. It's an appalling situation. The police officer involved should be charged, has been charged, and will hopefully be found guilty. I think the problem is that the AG has raised the charge to second-degree murder, which is going to be far harder to prove than third degree. We can talk about that a little bit later. But in some ways, the path of justice is being followed here. Like something awful happened and someone is facing the consequences. People protesting against, say, policies or systems in place which maybe encourage or apologize for instances like this, I think it's fine to protest. The line is crossed when things become violent. And riots are just appalling on so many levels. Firstly, it does damage to the communities that these people claim to be fighting in favor of. And so I find the apologists for rioting completely despicable. You see this both in politics, you see this from governors and mayors, and you see this from a lot of political activists and elements of the media when they're saying like, oh yes, rioting is bad, but. It's like, there's no but here. Rioting is bad. It destroys communities, it destroys lives, it destroys businesses. There is no excuse for this. And to claim that it's like a valid outlet for anger, I think is really bigotry of low expectations in a lot of ways, that people often from their ivory towers say, the media say, oh, well, people need to let this anger go. They have justified anger and it's the way they express their anger. Firstly, they're not usually smashing up their home and their business. And so it's very easy to say that from afar. Secondly, it's looking down on a community when you make that, I think, quite bigoted statement that the only way people can express their anger is through violence. And that's just simply not the case. The vast majority of protesters are peaceful protesters. And I feel like the media and a lot of the political following is focusing on the rioting because it either paints the entire movement as invalid, or it's a good distraction to get people riled up at what they see as the clear racism in America. So I think it's very cynical and it's honestly quite depressing. I mean, you spend time on Twitter and Instagram, you see all these videos of people, Black people, white people, Asian people, Hispanic people, their businesses being destroyed, and just standing there like, well, what do I do? Like, my government betrayed me. In many cases, mayors and governors have told police not to intervene. That's the primary role of government, and they're failing. It's despicable.
Yeah, yeah. And on a local level, you seem like on the local level, the government's failing. And I want to talk about the federal level and how Trump's handling this in 1 second. But you didn't mention George Floyd and kind of the second degree or third degree murder and what you think. What do you think there? Well, what's going on there, and why do you say you think it's being like kind of overdone in a sense?
I think the problem is that understandably in situations like this, there's a lot of emotion. And people, when they see someone on video do something so utterly despicable, they want to see justice done, and often as forcefully as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And Keith Ellison, who is the Attorney General in Minnesota, terrible congressman. He's said some horrific things. He's been pretty anti-Semitic in the past. There's that famous picture of him holding up the Antifa book and smiling. So he's pretty far left. I don't know what's in his heart or his objective, but I'm concerned that by going for second-degree murder over third-degree murder, he's going to make it harder to convict in court, which makes it a possibility that, I know Ben Shapiro talked about this on his podcast, makes it quite possible that this police officer is not found guilty. And can you imagine the outcry and the anger towards that? I mean, we're going to be in the 1990s again.
Yeah.
And so it's a case of, I think, overzealous attorney general who sees this as a political opportunity to throw the book at someone, which is fine. I'm more than in favor of holding someone to the full extent of the law. But the goal should be to convict and to put them in jail, not to get the press of charging them as strongly as possible and then failing. I mean, I know that the lawyer who's representing George Floyd's family tried to call it first-degree murder. He said it was premeditated first-degree murder. So you just don't have evidence for that. And while it sounds good, it gets press coverage, the goal should be getting the police officer in jail, not getting the headlines for saying, yep, we're gonna have him executed in the public square. And then when it doesn't happen, you've let people down. So if we truly want justice, we need to focus on getting him in jail, not getting the headlines.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that is a fair point. I didn't listen to Ben Shapiro this week, just because I didn't feel like it. But I that's interesting that you're saying that, because I was reading about some of the autopsy stuff,
Mm-hmm.
And just what's going down with that. And then I also talked to my mentor who was telling me about it. And what he said was he has a doctor buddy who said he was on 2 drugs at the time, which was methamphetamine, and then I think the other one was...
I think fentanyl was the other one.
Yeah, fentanyl. And one's an upper and the other one's a downer, which could cause a lot of problems with the heart. So they're saying, like, even though that the cop definitely killed him,
mm-hmm.
It might end up being a mistrial because of those things being in the system. And so it's like, and that's what we went to. Like, it's going to be the LA riots all over again if that's what happens. Like, that would not fare well. And I hope it doesn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he did kill him.
Yes.
Say whatever you want. He did it, right? And you're right. What needs to be the focus now is justice, not let's politicize it and make it about something other than what it actually is, the loss of life, because that's what happened. George Floyd was murdered, and let's stick with that. Let's not try to make it more than it already is. So now that you said that about the Ben Shapiro show, now I have to go back and listen. So.
But I think that's the thing we should always be focusing on, is what is the common goal. And I think the greatest problem I see right now is that we're not agreeing on what the common goal is. I think there are a lot of people, the vast majority, who despise racism, who want to see it eradicated in every way that they can.
Yeah.
And also despise police brutality, including the vast majority of police officers. In this instance, I think there's some evidence coming out that it may have been racially motivated, but we don't know fully that it was racially motivated. And so this should be about, firstly, getting justice for George Floyd and that the person who killed him goes to jail. And then secondly, looking at the policies that led to this and changing them. So if that means eradicating the knee on the back of the neck policy, which I think seems pretty obvious, that should be done. The issue comes when instances like this are used as proof of systematic racism without ever having to justify that step.
Yeah.
And it becomes very, very dangerous, because then you get people like Kamala Harris standing up, who I think Kamala Harris, I'm going to say this, is just, quite frankly, a race hustler. Like, she's thrown a ton of people in jail, and then she gets to step back and then pretend that her history doesn't exist, and now completely flip on the issue of law and order. But she was saying that she doesn't know, I think, a black man or an African-American man who hasn't felt racially discriminated against by the police. Now, that's a very subtle argument she's making, but the problem is we've got violent events of police brutality, and then we've got a feeling of discrimination. Those two things are very different things.
Yeah.
Like, one you can have evidence for and you can have a policy against. The other is, I'm sure there are some cases where it's real discrimination, and there are probably others where it's the feeling of discrimination. That's not something you can legislate for. And I think that's the thing we really need to be careful, is that line between the two, and do not allow politicians to blur the two so that they can use the weight of violent police brutality to justify their policies on the back of effectively subjectivity and feelings. It's a very dangerous thing, and I think we should respect the feelings of people who do feel discriminated against and look into cases if they're reported. But we've got to acknowledge that there is a difference between violent police brutality and the feeling of being discriminated against.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Because it's you need evidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole point. Just your feelings aren't evidence; they're your feelings, unfortunately, right? I mean,
Yep.
but that's what, honestly, I think that's what a lot of people deal with right now, is they're emotionally upset,
Mm-hmm.
and
Justifiably.
yeah, and but I feel like the response that people take because of their emotions is very immature, right? And that's kind of what being a mature person is like learning how to control your emotions, right? Because I have family and friends who are very upset about what's going on, but they're not out rioting.
Mm-hmm.
They're handling it in a mature fashion. You know, they might be posting things, they might be talking to other people about these things, which is fine by me. The conversations are necessary and good, right? But where I draw the line is when you think that you try to justify people running out on the streets and completely destroying these businesses and stuff. And then for Kamala Harris to sit around and say, most Black people feel that way, all you're doing is okaying what is already happening.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, like, you know what you guys are doing is wrong. You guys might feel this way, which you have every right to, but there's better ways to come about this, right? And I think there are some who are handling it properly. And unfortunately, like you mentioned, the vast majority of them are not being reported on.
Mm-hmm.
I even saw an article today, and I don't want to go too far into it, but because I didn't really read a lot of it because it annoyed me, just like the first 3 paragraphs, so I can't read this. But what it was saying was that it was telling white people to stop reposting videos of cops hugging other people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, but isn't this what we want? You know, don't we want to see some reconciliation? So then if you don't want that, then what do you want? And the author of the article wasn't African American. I didn't look them up. So, but they seem to be more Asian or white. Again, I don't know. And I'll send it to you on,
Okay.
I'll email it to you or send it to you. And maybe that's something we could talk about next time. But that angered me to know I couldn't even read it. I'll try to read it another time, but I had to stop because it's just like, this is like, to me, that was just dumb.
Yeah.
But going back to where we were before we went into this thing about George Floyd and justice, you talked about how it was on the state and local level, things aren't going well as far as the politicians handling business. But then you also have Donald Trump on the other end, who is claiming like, oh, I'm going to send in the National Guard. This was not
Mm-hmm.
going to happen. To even quote unquote, which I don't know if it's true or not. I want to get your take on this as well. Tear gassing people for a photo op in front of St. John's Church over there in Washington, D.C. So how do you think it's being handled on the federal level, predominantly by Donald Trump?
Yeah, so I think Donald Trump has been quite poor throughout this whole process. I think the media's the impression the media have given of him has been in many ways false. Like, for example, the tear gas thing. I don't believe it was tear gas. I think it was like smoke grenades. But like the media don't care anymore. Like every day I see posts from the media that just abjectly false. Journalism is quite frankly dead in many ways. But I think there are valid criticisms of Donald Trump. I think he was silent for too long. And in situations like these, you do need a common voice, regardless of how it would have been received. I think there are plenty of people who have made their mind up on Donald Trump and can never be changed. They think he's a racist bigot who is the cause of all racism in America, both before and after his presidency. But the fact is, there are many people who will listen to him, and it's part of his job. Mm-hmm. So I think his silence was not great early on. I think him threatening to use the National Guard to try and clamp down on some of this violence is completely justified. That is the federal government's job if the state governments aren't doing their job. People are not being protected. You're seeing cities being ransacked and destroyed and their citizens left undefended. And so that is really, in my mind, a lot of the role of the federal government is to step in situations like this. Again, he's not going to get the support of the media because the media are all in against him. They're also supporting Joe Biden during this period, which I think is hilarious. Joe Biden's just sitting in his bunker, enjoying his pudding, saying a few sentences that don't really make any sense, but that's just Joe Biden. So I think Donald Trump has done an okay job. I think the media have treated him drastically unfairly, but there are definitely elements of what Donald Trump has done and said which I think have been quite poor. I think his Twitter behavior is, as always, pretty terrible. I think that's a general consistent state for Donald Trump, is just that his Twitter is a nightmare.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a lose-lose situation. The issue here is that the expectations for the federal government differs based on who is president. So when a Democrat is president, then the issue is systematic racism that even the president, the messianic Democratic president, cannot solve. And so when there were effectively the same kind of riots when Barack Obama was president, the issue was the deep underlying racism of America that not even Barack Obama can solve. Now Donald Trump is president, suddenly it's lowered, the expectations are lowered, and that racism is because of Donald Trump. And if we only elected a Democrat, then all these problems would go away. You see this on Twitter every day of like, oh, well, the way we fight this is we vote. Minnesota, the mayor is Democrat, the police chief is Democrat, they have Democratic congressmen, women, and they have Democratic senators. So what are we saying here? If is the solution to the problem that is caused by Democrats, more Democrats, it's a pretty hard argument to make.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I don't see how, see, you said it fine. I'm not going to touch it. Perfectly said. So going back to the instance of what happened in front of St. John's Church, what I'm confused about is this. I don't know exactly what happened. Like, you get two different reports. You hear the speaker for Trump, what's her name? Her name's Kayleigh, but I can't remember exactly.
Kayleigh McEnany?
Yeah, I forget what her position is called right now.
Press secretary.
Yes, there we go. Press secretary. You hear she said we didn't tear gas anyone. Mm-hmm. But she specifically said we didn't tear gas anyone and left it at that. But then they're saying, like, well, they have the containers that they use to spray at the people and all this stuff. And all this stuff is getting blown out of proportion. And then I was talking with someone the other day and I said, it's one of two things. Either he did or he didn't. Mm-hmm. I said, but now the problem is it's how you feel towards him on which one is right.
Yeah.
Right. If you don't like him, oh, he definitely tear gas those people. If you do like him, he definitely didn't tear gas those people. My stance is, I don't know. It seems like something happened, but that's like you're saying, journalism's dead, and I don't know who to trust. I don't know who I could take seriously. And it goes for something that even happened yesterday, as people were tweeting out about Twitter's the worst. It's like the trash can of all social media. But even I saw this on Twitter where they were retweeting this event that happened that Trump apparently stated that George Floyd was happy looking down because the economy was good.
And it's just false.
And I saw like that full clip. Go ahead. Take it away.
It's just like, you're right. It's just completely false. And that's the greatest issue we face is that facts aren't really an issue anymore. Everything is just a Rorschach test for who you like and who you dislike. As you said, I think you hit the nail completely on the head in that if you hate Trump, then he's the cause of all wrong, and that he definitely fired tear gas at people for a photo op, and him holding up a Bible is obscene. But if you love Trump, then that image of him walking through the aftermath of a riot was, I mean, you've seen the the MAGA tweets about how amazing it was, and oh, look at him, he's got, he's so strong, he's so fast. It's like, there's a middle ground here of, we don't believe tear gas was used. There's no evidence that tear gas was used. The reporting on the ground is often false. And the claim that they were peaceful protesters is just not true. When you have a church that every president in the last couple of hundred years has been to and it's trying to be burnt down, these aren't peaceful protesters anymore. And so I desperately wish we could just take a step back and stop being so partisan with our judgment of the truth and just look at the facts of the ground. There's plenty that you can criticize Trump for objectively. He does ridiculous things every day. You don't need to make stuff up. But when the media is taking his statement, he was talking specifically about equality and that hopefully George Floyd would agree with it or support it. Personally, I hate using people who have passed away or being killed to make any political statement. But that's just politics. Every single politician does this.
Yeah.
And for the Democrats to claim that a Republican is dreadful for doing it, they all do this. So if we have a problem, we should have a problem with both sides. But then to claim that he was talking about equality, to claim that he was touting the economic numbers with George Floyd's name is disgustingly false.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that no one is pointing out that that is disrespectful of George Floyd also, to use his name in a lie is horrendous. But it won't be fact checked. It'll be ignored. It'll be let go because most of the media is bought into this narrative, and people consume this media wanting that narrative.
Yeah.
So it's hugely depressing, honestly.
Yeah. But one thing I did notice about with all these protesting and things going on as of late is that it seems like a lot of people stopped caring about COVID-19.
Yeah, that's gone now.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to get your take on what you think's going on with this. Like, why? Because it seemed like COVID-19 was a pandemic that was going to be just as bad as the Spanish flu. That's what it seemed like it's going to happen. And people were even saying they're getting anxious about the second wave that's coming because we lowered the curve, just like they said they wanted us to do. We lowered the curve. And so we started opening back up America. But now we have COVID-19 and protesting, right? Because they're both still very real, as far as I could tell, because for the past 2.5 months, all I heard about was COVID-19. So I haven't forgotten about it. So what do you think about this whole like protesting and COVID-19 thing, and how like no one's telling people not to protest because of it?
Yeah. So I think it's a really interesting and important question. I think there's this middle ground I'm trying to occupy where I've been pretty vocal about COVID-19 from the start. I've supported people wearing masks.
Mm-hmm.
I, to some extent, have supported the initial lockdown so that we could basically get on our feet and work out what was going on. The subsequent politicization of it has been where the issue is, where it has been an opportunity for the Democrats to stretch this out, blame Trump for everything that happens, and try and make that last until 2020. I mean, you've seen the way that different states have handled it differently. You've got New York has just been the worst. It's been an absolute disaster. And Florida has done really well. I mean, they have a lot of old people who haven't died. New York, ton of old people who have died. Like, there are clear policy differences that have made a clear difference here.
Mm-hmm.
So I think coronavirus was real. I think it is real. I think it will come back in the winter. I think we're enjoying the fact that it doesn't spread outside and that most people have probably already been exposed and so are to some extent immune. So herd immunity is kind of doing its thing. With the warm weather, it's not spreading as much. So I think we are riding that lull. I don't think it's going to be anywhere near as big a deal as they wanted it to be. But now the political class have a better weapon to attack Trump with. And so coronavirus, they're really showing what they actually thought about coronavirus because they don't truly care. Right now, it's better to have these protests, these riots, because that bodes far better for them in 2020 than a pandemic really ever could. A side note, I also think it shows the inherent bigotry of a lot of local politicians. I think Bill de Blasio is a fantastic example of he was tweeting nonstop about all these Jews going out to funerals in public. You know, it would be like a couple of hundred Jews to a couple of thousand Orthodox Jews in New York. He tweeted specifically at the Jewish community about playing a part in spreading this disease. And yet, when it's other populations who are out protesting, including his daughter, who got arrested, by the way, he's got nothing but praise for her. If that's not a double standard, I don't know what is. That you can criticize Jews for going to a funeral and yet praise others for going to a funeral, going to a protest. One of these things is inconsistent. And the fact that, again, the media is ignoring this just shows, quite frankly, how much they are happy to go along with the Democrat narrative, but also how little they care about anti-Semitism. I hate to always bring it back to this, but it blows my mind that the left claim to be the party of tolerance. They want to end racism. They want to end bigotry, except for the Jews. You know, the Jews don't really count.
Yeah. And I read your article the other day that you posted talking about anti-Semitism. I believe it was in California. Am I not mistaken?
I can't remember. Can you remember what was the topic? I've written a few about anti-Semitism.
Okay. No, I can't. It was something. There was some anti-Semitic event that happened. I believe it was in California. You posted that a week ago. And I remember reading. I don't know if it was your article or someone else's, but I remember reading. Oh,
about the synagogue in LA that got vandalized.
There we go. Yes, that was it. Yeah, I knew it was in California. Yeah, the synagogue that got vandalized. But yeah, it's not really talked about.
Yeah, it's just part of the fight for justice, man. It's if Jews have to fall to get justice, that's just what's needed to be done. It's just like that's what history has shown us time and time again, is that Jews unfortunately don't count, especially now that Jews are higher up on this intersectional hierarchy of power, and so they can't really be victims because they're too powerful. It's obscene, but that's the situation we live in right now.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. It's just, and that's what gets me. It's like, if we really want to talk about, like, I don't like the term like social justice, because it makes no sense to me. But I am for justice, right? Like, I'll stand for justice, and see that's what I feel like, that adjective prior to the word, like, oh, we just don't want justice, we want social justice. Yeah. It's like, so then, since it really doesn't mean much, you can morph it into mean whatever you want to mean, and just standing, instead of just saying we're just for justice. Because if I'm for justice, if there's injustice anywhere, then I am by obligation have to speak up for it. By obligation, I have to say something. I can't say anything. I can't do nothing else but say, yeah, this is wrong. Right? Because I remember I watched I saw someone post a tweet about Bill de Blasio, that very thing, about him okaying one thing, but then telling the Jews not to do the very same thing he okayed other people to do. And I'm like, and this is the mayor of New York City? like seriously. And like, you're right. And that's why I always say, like, I just wish Trump would do the same thing, because then, like, they have to look at it. Because it seems like if it's everything, like, everything's an unpardonable sin if you're Trump or a conservative. But if you're not, then it's forgivable. It's like, yeah. Or it's not even looked at, right? Because I'm definitely against anti-Semitism. And if I even hear people talk about, like, oh, the Jews, like, no, you're wrong. Because I stand for justice. You don't talk about people that way, because I've been talked about that way. Blacks this, black that. No, it's wrong. So when you throw a Jew in there, it's the same thing. It's still wrong.
Yeah.
But because you have a lot of Jewish people who are fairly wealthy, like, they own a lot of different companies, things like that, then they are dismissed. I think you're right about that.
Well, it's also the funniest thing. I get accused of being, a Democrat shill, a Zionist shill, all of these different kinds of shills, and it's like, if there was an international conspiracy that the world was led by Jews, I would have way more money than I have right now. It's like, so if there is a conspiracy, it's not a very good one.
No, do a better job at it. Okay. All right. So, final topic, I wanted to talk with you a bit about just like the opening up of America. I know you're here on the West Coast like myself. I'm personally in Las Vegas. And I can't stand our governor, Sisolak. I think he wants to do what the rest of the West is doing, like California and Washington. But he neglects the fact that our COVID-19 numbers weren't nearly as bad as California and Washington. Right. So I'm kind of annoyed at him, the way he's opening things up. But things are opening up, so I'm happy for that. But what do you think about just things starting to open up and things going back to what they call, like, the new normal?
Oh, that phrase, the new normal. I think in some ways it's interesting. I think the protests have proven that we need to open up. Like, if you can permit people to walk the streets within 3 inches of each other, throwing bricks at cops, and you should be able to go to a restaurant. Like, it's insane to claim that you can do one and not the other. So we clearly need to open up. What I hope is that we won't do this. California is an absolute sort of, I don't want to curse on a show. It's an absolute mess. Gavin Newsom is a human Ken doll with no brain. All he does is apologize for things and do nothing at the same time. I think there's question marks of corruption, given that he's Nancy Pelosi's nephew. It's like a lot of nepotism going on. Anyway, he clearly needs to open up, and I think the goal needs to be to have these sensible positions put in place so that in the event of a resurgence of COVID-19, which I think will happen, that we're prepared. So it needs to be situations where basic hygiene is kept up. I feel it's hilarious, like the notion of basic hygiene has suddenly been rediscovered. Like when I was still working in an office before we all got told to work from home, being told, like, oh, you should wash your hands before you eat and after using the bathroom. It's like, oh, really? Duh. Like, the fact that these are the steps that we've had to learn through a pandemic is insane to me. So we should all keep these basic things going. I think we need to be prepared to isolate people who are in the same way we should do for things like the flu. We should isolate people who are vulnerable, but we should also understand that we can't make these huge binary switches without impact on the economy and therefore millions of people's lives. I mean, like the fact that tens of millions of people are unemployed right now who weren't a few months ago with no real economic factors beyond the fact that we decided to turn our economy off is ridiculous. Like most recessions are caused by something that are to some extent out of our control. And this one, like we chose to enter a recession. And quite frankly, if you care about conservatism and if you want Trump to win, things need to open as quickly as possible, because the longer this goes on, the longer the subsequent impacts will last. Because you can't just turn the economy back on again and expect everything to go back. There are businesses that are shut down that won't come back now. There are people who have financial obligations that they can't escape after this period of time. And so the longer it goes on, the longer the damage is going to last. And quite frankly, this is the cynic in me. I think a lot of Democrats wanted this recession, and they're going to take full advantage of it. This is the crisis they were waiting for, and they want to play it out, and they think that Biden is going to come and save us all, which, if you're putting your hope in that man, then more power to you, I guess. But he doesn't know where he is or who he is, and he's going to save us. We don't need saving. I think this is what I want to end my conversation with you with. It's like, we do not need saving. Everyone calling for this one politician to come in. We do not need this one politician. The whole point of America is that we are individuals who, if we share a common goal and a common set of values, we can achieve what we need to achieve. We don't need this king sitting in the White House telling us what to do and how to be. And I think that's a huge step back that we've regressed into feeling that we need that in a leader. Okay.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. I think you're completely correct, especially when it comes to people wanting a recession. Mm-hmm. There is a famous political pundit who actually prayed, even though he's agnostic, prayed for a recession.
Yeah.
And so it's like, you got it. People were dying and struggling, and like it was, but that's what you wanted. But yet you're still going to be able to say what you want to say and continue to have a job. Mm-hmm. I feel like if anyone else were to say, I hope a recession happens, they should be at like, and you're as popular as you are, making statements like that. I think there's definitely some repercussions I need to happen for saying stuff like that.
Yeah.
And like, because I mean, you're talking about, there was suicide rates went up, depression rates went up, domestic violence went up. Mm-hmm. All these things were happening during this COVID-19 thing, which happened because of a recession. And yet you're still like, okay with it and going to continue to say whatever you want to say and act like, forget I said that. Like, no, I don't think that's just when it comes to how they treat everyone else, like Drew Brees, who said what he said. And then he apologized, but it's like, are people going to apologize what they said to him?
Well, I think with Drew Brees, he shouldn't have apologized because he's lost both sides of the argument now. Like, he came out and said what he said. If you actually read what he said, it's not that controversial. He's just saying what the flag means to him, what the national anthem means to him, and what kneeling during the national anthem means to him. Like, that's not controversial. I believe we live in a free country where you're allowed to have your own opinions. But the fact that he was bullied into silence and now folded, you've got to stand up for what you believe. And people like him, I understand that he's got a career that requires a lot of support and that he has financial obligations, things like that. But unless people start standing up for fundamental things they believe, like respect to the flag or what the country means to you, then we don't really have a country anymore. If a mob can bully you into thinking, at least outwardly, saying what they want you to say, then it's borderline fascism, honestly. Like, I know people will think I'm being over the top and saying it's hyperbole, but a lot of what we are seeing in the streets right now is fascism, of using violence and social threats and shaming and guilt to get the result you want. It's all really the same thing, like making people feel individually responsible for others' racism. Like, no one is guilty for anyone's actions except their own. Like, I'm not guilty for the police officer who killed George Floyd, in the same way that modern day Germans aren't guilty for what the Nazis did. There's no such thing as guilt that spreads across individuals who weren't involved. And I think for a lot of people to accept that is quite appalling. because it's just you're assigning guilt based on race or economic status or gender, and there's nowhere good to go from here. It just segregates us into these classes where you can't escape and you're not viewed as an individual.
Yeah. Yeah. White guilt, stupid.
You said it.
It is. White guilt, stupid. There it is.
Well, all we've got to do is that the claim that racism exists along a hierarchy is ridiculous. Like that racism is tied to power is ridiculous. Like saying something like white guilt should be viewed with just as much scorn as something like black guilt. But the fact is it's not, because people say like, oh, well, you can't be racist towards white people because white people have power. So, well, firstly, that's not true. There are a ton of white people in America who live in abject poverty. Are they powerful? Do they have power in this hierarchy? No. Racism is the feeling that one race is superior to another and discriminating against different races because of that. That is what racism is. And so it doesn't exist on a hierarchy. It's just thinking you're better than someone else based on some immutable characteristic that has nothing to do with their character. Yeah. And we've forgotten what racism is. It's like, this is how racism comes back, as if we just redefine it to what's politically convenient.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're 100% correct. That definition is crucial. Understanding what real racism is. A lot of people wouldn't use that word anymore, but anyone could be all white. So by that definition of the people who's in power, then yes, all white people are racist, even though that a lot of white people aren't in power, right? But it's because they have a lot of other white people who are in power. So therefore, since they're white and you're white, then you're all right. And so it just, and like you said earlier, this is a country that's built more on individualism and not based on that, right? Not based on the collectivist mindset that really is starting to take over in people's thinking.
But it's very easy.
Yeah,
it's very easy to view yourself I think a lot of people have almost a selfish view of collectivism, where they are an individual, but everyone else is a collective. And so it's very easy then to dismiss individual viewpoints you don't like because it's part of a collective you don't like. And so if you have a bunch of selfish people who all think they're individuals, like unique individuals in this system of collectivism, you end up with people like AOC being our thought leaders of the time, where they just say ridiculous things and people see themselves in that. And so she rises in the ranks. It's just kind of unbelievable, but it's not going to change unless we all come together on a set of shared values. And right now, I couldn't name one shared value, honestly. I feel a few years ago, most people would have been at least in favor of like America being a good thing, just generally. But even that's not true. Like, can you name a shared value that we all hold?
I mean, I guess if I tried hard enough, maybe, but like right now at this point, no, because I would say America is still a good country. I would say we have a long way to go, but I don't even think they'd say that.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's probably some Democrats who would probably lean that way.
Oh, some, but there's no universal value.
No, but yeah, because some don't. Yeah, there's no foundation. Like the foundation is cracked. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, no, there's there's no end in sight. You know, and that's, I think that's what you're getting at. There's no end in sight. Like it seems like it's just going to keep getting worse, which is unfortunate. You know, it's truly unfortunate.
Yeah.
But Ian, it's always a pleasure talking to you, my friend.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll send you that link to that article, and then maybe that could be a point of conversation the next time we chat. Hopefully, sooner than later.
Sounds great. I'll try and make it more. I'll try and beat you. I'll try and make it more than 3 paragraphs through before I go crazy. Let's see if I can do it.
Good luck. Let me know. Can you just give me notes?
No promises.
All right, my friend. You take care now.
Thank you. Speak to you soon.
All right, man.